The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of the Sterling mansion as Maria quietly pushed her cleaning cart down the hallway. At 28, she had been working as a housekeeper for the wealthy Sterling family for nearly 3 years. Her calloused hands gripped the cart handle firmly as she moved from room to room, her presence almost invisible to the family that lived in this palace of luxury. Maria had learned to be invisible. It was safer that way. She had seen what happened to staff members who drew too much attention to themselves in houses like this. They disappeared quietly, their positions filled by someone new within days. She needed this job desperately. Her younger brother Carlos was in his final year of medical school, and the money she sent home every month was the only thing keeping his dreams alive. The Sterling mansion sat on 15 acres of perfectly manicured grounds in the most exclusive part of the city. Richard Sterling, the man who owned it all, had built his empire from nothing. At 52, he controlled a business worth over $3 billion. His companies had interests in everything from real estate to technology, and his name appeared regularly in business magazines as one of the most ruthless and successful entrepreneurs of his generation. Maria had rarely interacted with Mr. Sterling directly. She usually worked when he was at his office, cleaning the vast house while he conducted his business downtown. When their paths did cross, he barely acknowledged her existence. To him, she was just another piece of furniture, there to serve a purpose and nothing more. But today was different. Today, Richard Sterling was working from home, and his mood was darker than usual. His latest business deal had fallen through spectacularly. A merger he had been orchestrating for months had collapsed when his partner discovered some of Sterling's more questionable business practices. The failure had cost him nearly $50 million and damaged his reputation in ways that money couldn't easily repair. As Maria entered the study to clean, she could hear Sterling shouting into his phone. His face was red with anger, and his usually perfect appearance was disheveled. His tie was loose, his expensive suit jacket thrown carelessly over a chair. Empty glasses and crumpled papers covered his normally pristine desk. "I don't care what it takes," Sterling was yelling into the phone. "Find me another way to make this happen. I didn't get where I am by accepting defeat from some small-time nobody who thinks he can outsmart me." Maria tried to clean quietly around him, dusting shelves and emptying trash bins without making a sound. She had perfected the art of being invisible, moving through rooms like a ghost. But today, Sterling's anger seemed to fill every corner of the space, making the air thick and dangerous. When Sterling finally ended his call, he slammed the phone down so hard that Maria jumped. A small crystal paperweight on a nearby shelf rattled, and before she could catch it, it fell to the floor with a sharp crack. The sound echoed through the suddenly silent room like a gunshot. Sterling's head snapped toward her, his eyes blazing with fury. "What did you just do?" His voice was low and menacing, the kind of tone that made Maria's blood run cold. "I'm sorry, Mr. Sterling," Maria said quickly, kneeling to pick up the pieces of broken crystal. "It was an accident. I'll replace it immediately." "Replace it?" Sterling's laugh was harsh and bitter. "Do you have any idea what that cost? It was handcrafted in Venice, worth more than you make in 6 months. Maria's hands shook as she carefully gathered the sharp fragments. She could feel Sterling's anger radiating toward her like heat from a fire. "Please, Mr. Sterling, I can pay for it. I'll work extra hours, "You'll what?" Sterling stood up from his chair, his tall frame looming over her as she knelt on the floor. "You think your pathetic wages could ever cover the value of my possessions? You people are all the same. Careless, worthless, thinking you can just apologize your way out of any mistake." The words hit Maria like physical blows. She had heard similar comments before, whispered behind closed doors by wealthy employers who thought their staff couldn't hear. But never had they been directed at her so directly, with such venom. "Mr. Sterling, please," she began, but he cut her off. "Please what? Please forgive poor little Maria who can't do her job properly. Please pretend this didn't happen so you can continue living off my generosity." Maria stood slowly, the broken pieces of crystal cupped in her palms. Her dark eyes met his for just a moment before she looked down again. "I understand you're upset, sir. I take full responsibility for the accident." "Responsibility," Sterling's voice rose. "You want to talk about responsibility? Let me tell you about responsibility, girl. I built this empire with my own hands. I worked 16-hour days while people like you were probably still in diapers. I earned every dollar, every possession in this house through blood, sweat, and sacrifice. He began packing around her like a predator circling prey. And then people like you come into my home, into my space, and treat my possessions like they're worthless trinkets. You have no concept of value, no understanding of what it takes to create wealth. Maria remained silent, knowing that anything she said would only fuel his anger further. She had learned this lesson from her father, who had worked as a janitor in office buildings and came home with stories about executives who would explode over the smallest mistakes. "Look at me when I'm talking to you," Sterling demanded suddenly. Maria raised her eyes to meet his gaze. She saw something there that frightened her more than his anger. There was a cold calculation, a sense that he was evaluating her worth as a human being and finding her lacking. "Do you know how easy it would be for me to destroy your life?" Sterling asked quietly. "One phone call to immigration services, one word to other wealthy families in this city. I could ensure you never work in a decent home again." The threat hung in the air between them like a loaded gun. Maria felt her heart pounding in her chest, but she forced herself to remain calm. She thought of Carlos, studying late into the night in his tiny dorm room, depending on her to keep sending money for his tuition and living expenses. "I understand, Mr. Sterling," she said quietly. "Do you?" He stepped closer, close enough that she could smell the expensive cologne mixed with sweat and anger. "I don't think you do. I don't think you understand your place in this world at all." Sterling's hand moved to straighten his tie, and Maria noticed his knuckles were white with tension. His breathing was shallow and rapid, like a man barely containing his rage. "Maybe it's time someone taught you a proper lesson about respect," he continued, "about understanding your position in life." Maria felt a chill run down her spine. There was something in his tone, in the way his eyes had changed, that warned her this situation was about to become much worse. She clutched the broken crystal pieces, feeling the sharp edges bite into her palms. "Mr. Sterling," she began carefully, "I've learned my lesson. I promise it won't happen again, if you'll just give me another chance." "Another chance?" Sterling's laugh was harsh and cold. "Chances are earned, not given, and right now I don't see anything about you that's worth a second chance." He reached out suddenly and grabbed her wrist, the one holding the broken crystal. His grip was strong enough to bruise, and Maria gasped as some of the sharp pieces cut deeper into her palm. "You're going to learn what happens when you disrespect me in my own home," Sterling said, his voice dropping to a whisper that was somehow more frightening than his shouting had been. Maria tried to pull away, but his grip tightened. "Mr. Sterling, please let go. You're hurting me." "Hurting you?" His eyes narrowed. "You haven't even begun to understand what hurt feels like." With his free hand, Sterling reached toward her hair. Maria's long black hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, practical for her work. As his fingers moved toward it, every instinct in her body screamed at her to run, to fight, to do whatever she could to get away from this man whose anger had transformed him into something monstrous. But she couldn't run. She needed this job. She needed the money. And even if she could escape this moment, where would she go? Sterling had made it clear he could destroy her future with a single phone call. Sterling's fingers tangled in her hair at the base of her ponytail. "Maybe if you spent less time worrying about your appearance and more time focusing on your work, accidents like this wouldn't happen." "Please," Maria whispered, her voice barely audible, "don't do this." But Sterling wasn't listening anymore. His business failure, his damaged reputation, his wounded ego, all of it seemed to be focused on this one moment, on this woman who had dared to break something that belonged to him. His grip on her hair tightened, and Maria felt the sharp tug as he began to pull. The pain shot through her scalp like electricity, bringing tears to her eyes. But it was more than physical pain. It was the humiliation, the powerlessness, the knowledge that she was completely at the mercy of a man who saw her as less than human. "This is what happens," Sterling said through gritted teeth, pulling harder, "when you forget your place." Maria's mind raced as the pain intensified. She thought of her grandmother, who had cleaned houses for wealthy families for over 40 years, and had taught Maria that survival sometimes meant enduring things that no human being should have to endure. She thought of her parents, who had sacrificed everything to give their children better opportunities. She thought of Carlos, who would never become a doctor if she lost this job. But as Sterling's grip tightened and the pain grew worse, something else began to rise in Maria's chest. It was a feeling she had kept buried for years, pushed down beneath layers of necessity and survival. It was anger, not the helpless rage of the powerless, but something deeper and more dangerous. Because Sterling didn't know who she really was. He didn't know about the secret she had carried for 3 years, the truth about her family that she had hidden from everyone in this city. He saw her as just another poor immigrant woman, easy to intimidate and control. He had no idea how wrong he was. Maria's free hand slowly moved toward the small pendant she wore around her neck, hidden beneath her uniform. It was a simple silver cross, the kind that millions of people wore. But this cross was different. Engraved on the back in letters so small they could barely be seen was a name that would stop Richard Sterling cold if he knew what it meant. The name belonged to Maria's grandfather, a man who had died when she was 12 years old. A man whose legacy lived on in ways that most people could never imagine. A man whose connections and influence reached into the highest levels of power, even decades after his death. As Sterling pulled harder on her hair, Maria made a decision that would change both of their lives forever. She was done being invisible. She was done being powerless. She was done letting people like Richard Sterling believe they could treat her like she was nothing. Her lips parted, and she prepared to speak the word that would transform her from victim to someone Sterling would never dare to touch again. The word that would reveal the truth about who she really was and what kind of power her family really wielded. The morning light streaming through the study windows seemed to grow brighter as Maria drew in her breath, ready to change everything with a single word. Sterling, lost in his rage and his need to dominate, had no idea that his world was about to be turned completely upside down by the woman whose hair he was pulling, whose spirit he thought he was breaking. The word that came from Maria's lips cut through the air like a blade through silk. It was spoken quietly, almost whispered, but it carried a power that made Richard Sterling freeze instantly. Sterling's grip on Maria's hair loosened as if he had been struck by lightning. His face, which had been red with anger moments before, suddenly drained of all color. The name hung in the air between them, and Maria could see the exact moment when understanding dawned in his eyes. "What did you just say?" Sterling's voice was barely a whisper now, all traces of his earlier rage replaced by something that looked suspiciously like fear. Maria straightened her shoulders, her dark eyes meeting his without flinching for the first time since she had started working in his house. When she spoke again, her voice was steady and clear, carrying an authority that seemed to come from nowhere. "My name is Maria, my grandfather was." Sterling released her hair completely and took a step backward, his face going even paler. The broken crystal fell from Maria's hands, scattering across the marble floor like forgotten tears. Even 20 years after his death, that name still carried weight in certain circles. He had been more than just a successful businessman. He had been a kingmaker, a man who had helped elect presidents and topple governments. His network of connections had spanned continents, reaching into the highest levels of politics, finance, and industry. But it had also been something else, something that made powerful men like Richard Sterling wake up in cold sweats when they remembered the stories. He had been a man who never forgot a slight, who could wait decades to exact revenge, and who had the resources and patience to destroy his enemies so completely that they simply vanished from public life. "That's impossible," Sterling stammered, but even as he said it, Maria could see him trying to reconcile this revelation with what he knew about her. Didn't have any living family. The entire line died out. Maria's smile was small but sharp as a knife's edge. "That's what everyone was supposed to believe, what my family wanted people to believe after grandfather's death. It was safer that way." She moved slowly around the room, no longer the cowering servant, but something entirely different. Her posture had changed, her voice had changed, even the way she looked at him had transformed completely. "You see, Mr. Sterling, when my grandfather died, there were certain people who might have wanted to settle old scores with his family. Powerful people who had been on the wrong side of his business dealings. So the family made a collective decision to disappear from public view." Sterling sank into his leather chair, his legs suddenly unable to support him. His mind was racing, trying to remember everything he knew about, trying to understand what this meant for him. "My parents changed their names," Maria continued, her voice calm and measured. "They moved to a different country, started over with new identities. My brother and I grew up knowing who we really were, but understanding that our survival depended on no one else knowing." She picked up the expensive pen from Sterling's desk, examining it casually as she spoke. Carlos isn't just studying to become a doctor, Mr. Sterling. He's studying to become a neurosurgeon, one of the most elite specializations in medicine. His tuition isn't being paid by my wages alone. There are certain trust funds, certain investments that my grandfather made before his death that are still generating income for his family. Sterling's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. But why? Why are you working as a maid? Why put yourself through this? Maria's laugh was soft but held no warmth. Because I chose to. Because I wanted to understand how people like you really think when you believe no one important is watching. Because I wanted to see firsthand how the wealthy treat those they consider beneath them. She set the pen down carefully on the desk and looked directly into Sterling's eyes. And because my grandfather taught me that the best way to destroy an enemy is to know them completely first, to understand their weaknesses, their secrets, their fears. Sterling's hands were shaking now. He reached for his phone, then stopped, as if unsure who he could call or what he could say. What do you want from me? Want? Maria seemed genuinely puzzled by the question. Mr. Sterling, I don't want anything from you. I already have everything I need. She walked to the window and gazed out at the perfectly manicured grounds. Do you know how my grandfather built his fortune? It wasn't through real estate or technology or any of the obvious paths to wealth. He built it by collecting information, by knowing secrets that other people would pay anything to keep hidden. Sterling felt ice forming in his stomach. I don't have any secrets. Maria turned back to him, and her smile was genuinely amused now. Mr. Sterling, everyone has secrets. The question is whether those secrets are interesting enough to matter. She moved to one of the and pulled out a volume at random. Take your recent business dealings, for example, the merger that fell through this morning. You've been telling people that your partner backed out due to market conditions. But that's not really what happened, is it? Sterling's face went white again. How could you possibly know about the offshore accounts? About the money you've been moving through shell companies to avoid taxes? About the bribes you paid to certain government officials to expedite permits for your construction projects? Each revelation hit Sterling like a physical blow. These were secrets he thought no one could know, details buried so deep that even his own lawyers weren't aware of all of them. You see, Maria continued conversationally, when you grow up in a family like mine, you learn certain skills. You learn how to access information that other people think is private. You learn how to track money through financial systems that were designed to hide it. You learn how to verify rumors and separate truth from speculation. She replaced the book on the shelf and dusted her hands off, the simple gesture somehow threatening. I've been watching you for 3 years, Mr. Sterling, not just working in your house, but really watching. Learning about your business practices, your personal habits, your relationships with other powerful people in this city. Sterling tried to stand up, but found that his legs wouldn't support him. What are you going to do with this information? That depends entirely on you. Maria moved back toward the desk, but now she wasn't approaching as a servant. She was approaching as an equal, someone who held his fate in her hands and knew it. You see, Mr. Sterling, I didn't reveal my identity because I was afraid of you. I'm not afraid of you at all. I revealed it because I wanted you to understand exactly how serious a mistake you were about to make. She gestured toward the floor where the broken crystal still lay scattered. A moment ago, you were ready to assault me over a broken paperweight. You were prepared to use your power to hurt someone you believed was helpless to fight back. Sterling's voice came out as barely a croak. I was angry. I wasn't thinking clearly. No, you were thinking perfectly clearly. You were thinking like a man who believes that money gives him the right to treat other human beings like property, like a man who has never faced real consequences for his actions. Maria sat down in the chair across from his desk, crossing her legs elegantly. The transformation from servant to sophisticated woman of power was so complete that Sterling wondered how he had ever been fooled. Now I want you to imagine something, Mr. Sterling. I want you to imagine what would happen if certain information about your business practices became public. Not rumors or speculation, but documented proof of criminal activity. Sterling's breathing became rapid and shallow. You're threatening me. I'm educating you, Maria corrected. I'm helping you understand the difference between having power and believing you're untouchable. She leaned forward slightly, her voice becoming more intimate but somehow more dangerous. The beautiful thing about my grandfather's legacy is that it's not just about money or connections. It's about patience. He taught our family that the best revenge is the kind that takes years to develop, that becomes so complete that the target never recovers. Sterling was sweating now despite the air conditioning in the room. What do you want me to do? I want you to think about the choices you've made in your life, Maria said simply. I want you to consider whether the man you've become is someone you can be proud of. She stood up and smoothed down her uniform, once again transforming her appearance, this time back toward the servant she had been pretending to be. But now Sterling could see it was only a costume, a role she had been playing. I also want you to think about this conversation every time you're tempted to abuse your power over someone you think can't fight back. Because now you know that you never really know who you're dealing with. Maria moved toward the door, then paused and looked back at him. Oh, and Mr. Sterling, that paperweight I broke, it was a fake. A very good one, but still a fake. I had it investigated when I first started working here. It's worth about $50, not the thousands you claimed. Sterling's jaw dropped open. But how did you? The same way I know everything else about you. The same way I know about the original paperweight, which you sold 2 years ago to cover gambling debts that your wife doesn't know about. She smiled one last time, and Sterling realized that this smile was the most terrifying thing he had ever seen. It wasn't cruel or vindictive. It was simply the smile of someone who held all the cards and was enjoying the game. I'll finish cleaning your study now, Mr. Sterling, unless you have any objections. Sterling could only shake his head, unable to find his voice. As Maria began cleaning around him, moving with the same quiet efficiency she had always shown, Sterling sat frozen in his chair, his mind reeling with the implications of what had just happened. In the space of a few minutes, his entire understanding of his world had been turned upside down. The woman he had been about to assault, the servant he had viewed as less than human, was connected to one of the most powerful and feared families in recent history. She had access to information that could destroy him completely. And perhaps most terrifying of all, she had been watching him for 3 years, learning his secrets, documenting his crimes. But as the initial shock began to wear off, another emotion began to creep into Sterling's mind. It was something he hadn't felt in years, something his wealth and power had protected him from for so long that he had almost forgotten what it felt like. It was fear. Real, bone-deep, soul-crushing fear of someone who had the power to destroy everything he had built. And as he watched Maria calmly dust the shelves around him, acting as if nothing had changed, Sterling began to realize that this was only the beginning. For the next 3 days, Richard Sterling lived in a state of constant anxiety that he had never experienced before. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by nightmares about federal investigators knocking on his door or waking up to find his assets frozen. He found himself jumping at unexpected sounds, checking his phone compulsively for news that might signal the beginning of his downfall. But nothing happened. Maria continued to come to work each day, arriving at the same time, cleaning with the same quiet efficiency, and leaving without any interaction beyond polite nods. She had returned to her role as the invisible servant, but now Sterling could see through the illusion. Every time she entered a room, he felt the weight of her hidden knowledge pressing down on him. The worst part was the uncertainty. What did she want from him? When would she make her move? Was she gathering more evidence, or was this some kind of psychological torture designed to drive him slowly insane? On Thursday morning, Sterling's anxiety reached a breaking point. He had barely eaten in 3 days, had missed 2 important business meetings, and had snapped at his assistant so harshly that she had submitted her resignation. His wife had noticed his strange behavior and kept asking if something was wrong, but he couldn't bring himself to explain the situation. How could he tell her that their entire life might be about to collapse because he had tried to assault their housekeeper? How could he admit that he had been exposed as a criminal by a woman he had treated as barely human? That morning, as Maria worked in the living room, Sterling finally couldn't stand the suspense any longer. He approached her slowly, like a man walking toward his own execution. "Maria," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper, "we need to talk." She looked up from the coffee table she was polishing, her expression neutral. "Of course, Mr. Sterling, how can I help you?" The casual politeness in her tone was almost worse than open hostility would have been. At least with hostility, he would know where he stood. "I need to know what you're planning to do," he said. "I can't live like this not knowing when." "When what, Mr. Sterling?" He struggled to find the right words. When you're going to destroy me. Maria set down her cleaning cloth and looked at him with what appeared to be genuine surprise. Is that what you think I'm planning to do? Isn't it? She studied his face for a long moment, and Sterling felt like she was reading his soul. Mr. Sterling, if I wanted to destroy you, why would I wait? I've had the power to do that for 3 years. Why haven't I used it? The question hit him like a physical blow. Why hadn't she? If she really had evidence of his criminal activities, if she really had the connections she claimed, what was stopping her? I don't understand, he admitted. Maria sighed softly and sat down in one of the expensive armchairs. It was the first time Sterling had ever seen her sit down in his presence, and the casual confidence of the gesture reminded him again that she was not what she appeared to be. My grandfather once told me something, she said. He said that the difference between justice and revenge is patience. Revenge is what you do when you're angry. Justice is what you do when you've had time to think clearly about right and wrong. Sterling remained standing, afraid to sit down, afraid to make any movement that might be interpreted as threatening. For 3 years, Maria continued, I've been watching you, learning about you, trying to understand what kind of man you really are underneath the wealth and power. And what did you decide? Maria's smile was sad rather than threatening. That you're not evil, Mr. Sterling, you're just lost. The words stung more than accusations would have. Sterling had been prepared for anger, for threats, for demands. He hadn't been prepared for pity. Lost. You've spent so many years focused on accumulating wealth and power that you've forgotten how to be human, Maria explained. You've surrounded yourself with people who tell you what you want to hear, who validate your worst impulses because they depend on you for their livelihoods. She gestured around the opulent room. All of this, the mansion, the cars, the private jets, they've become a prison. They've separated you from the real world so completely that you've lost the ability to see other people as human beings. Sterling felt his legs give way and he sank into the chair across from her. Then why reveal who you are? Why now? Because Monday morning, you crossed a line that I couldn't ignore. You were about to commit assault because someone broke a $50 trinket. You were so consumed with rage and the need to dominate that you were willing to physically hurt another human being. Maria leaned forward, her voice becoming more intense. If I had let you do that, if I had allowed you to continue down that path, then I would have been responsible for whatever you did next, and next time it might have been worse. Sterling thought about his actions that morning, really thought about them for the first time. He remembered the feeling of Maria's hair in his grip, the way she had trembled with fear, the complete powerlessness he had seen in her eyes, and he was horrified to realize that part of him had enjoyed it. What kind of monster am I? He whispered, more to himself than to her. You're not a monster, Maria said firmly, but you're becoming one and you don't even realize it. She stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the gardens that Sterling paid a small army to maintain. Money and power are like drugs, Mr. Sterling. They give you a feeling of invincibility, of being above the rules that apply to other people. But like any drug, they require bigger and bigger doses to achieve the same high. So what happens now? Sterling asked. What do you want from me? Maria turned back to him, and for the first time since Monday, she looked at him with something that might have been compassion. I want you to have a choice. What kind of choice? The same choice my grandfather gave to people in your position. You can continue being the man you've become and face the consequences of your actions, or you can choose to change. Sterling's heart began racing again. And if I choose to change? Then you prove it, not with words but with actions. Real, meaningful actions that demonstrate you understand the harm you've caused and are committed to making things right. How? Maria sat back down and looked directly into his eyes. First, you're going to voluntarily turn yourself in to the authorities for tax evasion and bribery. You're going to provide full cooperation with their investigation and accept whatever punishment the courts decide you deserve. Sterling felt the blood drain from his face. That would mean prison. My reputation would be destroyed. My business empire would survive or it wouldn't, Maria interrupted. But at least it would be built on something honest going forward. And if I refuse? Maria's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes became colder. Then I provide the evidence to the authorities myself, along with additional information about crimes you don't even realize I know about. The result is the same for you, but instead of being seen as someone who took responsibility for his actions, you're seen as someone who had to be dragged kicking and screaming to justice. Sterling buried his face in his hands. Everything he had worked for, everything he had built would be gone. His wife would leave him. His children would be ashamed to bear his name. He would lose everything that made him who he was. But as he sat there contemplating the destruction of his life, another thought began to emerge from the chaos in his mind. What exactly was he afraid of losing? His money, his mansion, his reputation in business circles. When was the last time any of those things had actually made him happy? When was the last time he had felt genuine joy or satisfaction or peace? He couldn't remember. The last few years had been an endless cycle of deals and acquisitions and power plays, each one requiring more ruthlessness than the last, each one leaving him feeling more empty inside. He thought about his relationship with his wife, which had become more like a business partnership than a marriage. He thought about his children, who only contacted him when they needed money. He thought about his employees, who feared him rather than respected him. Had his pursuit of wealth and power actually made his life better, or had it simply made him numb to how terrible his life had become? "There's something else," Maria said quietly, breaking into his thoughts. Sterling looked up at her, afraid to hear what came next. The choice isn't just about turning yourself in to the authorities. It's about what kind of person you want to be for the rest of your life. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small photograph, placing it on the coffee table between them. Sterling leaned forward to look at it and saw a picture of a young girl, maybe 8 or 9 years old, smiling at the camera. "This is Isabella Santos," Maria said. "She's the daughter of your former employee, Santos, who you fired 6 months ago." Sterling remembered vaguely. She had been one of the housekeepers, an older woman who had worked for the family for several years. "I fired her because she was stealing." "No," Maria said firmly. "You fired her because she asked for time off to take care of her granddaughter, who was sick with leukemia. You decided that made her unreliable, so you not only fired her, but also made sure she couldn't get hired by any other wealthy families in the area." Sterling felt sick. He remembered the incident differently, but as Maria spoke, he began to recall details he had pushed from his memory. Tears when she begged him to understand her situation. Her desperation when she promised to make up the missed time. "Lost her apartment because she couldn't find work," Maria continued. "She and Isabella are now living in a homeless shelter. Isabella's medical treatments have been interrupted because lost her health insurance." The photograph seemed to burn Sterling's eyes as he stared at it. The little girl's smile was so innocent, so full of trust in a world that was failing her. "Why are you telling me this?" he whispered. "Because this is what your choices look like in the real world," Maria said. "This is the human cost of your need to demonstrate power over people who can't fight back." Sterling felt tears beginning to form in his eyes. "What can I do? How can I fix this?" "That's not for me to decide. That's for you to figure out. But I will say this. If you're serious about changing, if you really want to become someone better than who you are right now, then Isabella would be a good place to start." Maria stood up and collected her cleaning supplies. "You have until Monday to make your decision about turning yourself in. If you choose to do the right thing, I'll help you figure out how to do it properly. If you don't." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. As she walked toward the door, Sterling called out to her. "Maria, why are you giving me this choice? After everything I've done, after the way I've treated you and people like you, why give me a chance to make things right?" Maria paused in the doorway and looked back at him. "Because my grandfather taught me that everyone deserves a chance at redemption, even people who don't think they deserve it. And if I can't change, if I'm too far gone." Her smile was sad but genuine. "Then at least you'll have had the opportunity to try, and that's more than most people get." After she left, Sterling sat alone in his living room for hours, staring at the photograph of Isabella Santos and thinking about the choice that lay before him. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about money or power or business deals. He was thinking about what kind of man he wanted to be when he died. And he was terrified to realize that if he died today, he would be remembered as someone who had made the world a worse place by being in it. Richard Sterling spent the weekend in a state of emotional turmoil unlike anything he had experienced since childhood. The photograph of Isabella Santos remained on his coffee table. a constant reminder of the harm his actions had caused to an innocent child. He found himself returning to it repeatedly, studying the little girl's face and trying to reconcile her obvious suffering with his own comfortable life. Saturday morning, Sterling did something he hadn't done in over a decade. He left his mansion without a driver, without a security detail, and without a specific business purpose. He drove through the city in his modest backup car, a vehicle he normally would have been embarrassed to be seen in. He found himself in neighborhoods he had forgotten existed, places where normal people lived normal lives. He saw families walking together, children playing in small parks, elderly couples sitting on porches and talking. The simplicity of it all struck him as both foreign and somehow appealing. As he drove, Sterling began to remember who he had been before money and power had consumed his life. He had grown up in a middle-class family in this very city. His father had been an accountant, his mother a school teacher. They hadn't been wealthy, but they had been happy. When had he stopped valuing happiness and started measuring everything in terms of wealth and control? That evening, Sterling called his wife into his study. She entered cautiously, clearly concerned about his strange behavior over the past week. "Richard, you're scaring me," she said, sitting down across from his desk. "You've been acting like a different person. Are you having some kind of breakdown?" Sterling looked at the woman he had been married to for 23 years and realized with a shock that he couldn't remember the last time they had really talked to each other. Not about business or social obligations or their children's achievements, but actually talked about their lives, their feelings, their dreams. He said slowly, "Do you remember why you married me?" The question seemed to catch her off guard. "What kind of question is that?" "A serious one. I need to know." She studied his face for a long moment, perhaps looking for signs of whatever had caused this sudden introspection. "I married you because you were ambitious and intelligent, and because you made me laugh. You had big dreams, but you hadn't forgotten how to enjoy simple pleasures." "And do I still make you laugh?" Silence was more eloquent than any words could have been. "When did we stop being happy?" Sterling asked. "I don't know," admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "It happened so gradually that I didn't notice until it was gone. One day we were planning a future together, and the next day we were just managing a lifestyle." They talked until nearly midnight, really talked for the first time in years. Sterling found himself telling her about his fears, his loneliness, his growing sense that his life had become hollow despite all his material success. Shared her own feelings of isolation, her sense that she had become more of a trophy wife than a partner in a real marriage. By the end of the conversation, both of them were crying, not from sadness, but from the relief of finally being honest with each other about how lost they had both become. Sunday morning, Sterling woke up with a clarity he hadn't experienced in years. He knew what he had to do, not because Maria had threatened him, but because it was the right thing to do. For the first time in decades, he was going to make a decision based on his conscience rather than his bank account. His first action was to research Santos and her granddaughter Isabella. Using his business connections, he was able to track down their current location and medical situation. What he learned made him physically sick. Had indeed been living in a homeless shelter with Isabella, but their situation was even worse than Maria had described. Isabella's leukemia had progressed to a dangerous stage because her treatments had been interrupted. The little girl was now in the hospital, and the doctors weren't optimistic about her chances without immediate and expensive treatment. Was working 3 part-time jobs, none of which provided health insurance, and sleeping in her car outside the hospital so she could be close to Isabella. The medical bills were already over $200,000, and the family had no way to pay them. Sterling stared at the information for a long time, thinking about the chain of events that had led to this situation. If he hadn't fired out of petty spite, she would still have had health insurance. Isabella would have received continuous treatment. The little girl might have been cured by now instead of fighting for her life. All of this suffering, because he had been offended that an employee had dared to prioritize her family over his convenience. Sterling picked up his phone and called his personal attorney, James Mitchell, who had helped him navigate countless legal challenges over the years. "Richard," James sounded surprised to hear from him on a Sunday, "is everything all right?" "No, James, everything is not all right. I need to see you first thing tomorrow morning. There are some things I need to tell you about my business practices, and I'm going to need your help turning myself in to the authorities." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Richard, I think you should be very careful about what you say, even to me, if you're in some kind of trouble." "I am in trouble, James. I've been in trouble for years, but I was too arrogant to see it. Tomorrow we're going to fix that." After he hung up, Sterling called the hospital where Isabella was being treated. It took some persistence, but he eventually got through to the billing department. "This is Richard Sterling," he said. "I want to pay the medical bills for a patient named Isabella Santos, all of them including any future treatments she might need." The woman on the other end of the phone was clearly confused. "I'm sorry, sir, but are you a relative of the patient? We can only discuss billing information with." "I'm not a relative. I'm the person who's responsible for her not having health insurance. Please transfer me to whoever can accept payment for her account." It took 2 hours and multiple transfers, but Sterling eventually succeeded in paying Isabella's entire medical debt and establishing a fund to cover any future treatments. He also arranged for her to be given a private room near the hospital so she wouldn't have to sleep in her car. But as Sterling hung up from that final call, he realized that money, while necessary, wasn't enough to undo the harm he had caused. And Isabella needed the medical bills paid, but they also deserved an apology. They deserved acknowledgement that what had happened to them was wrong. Monday morning, Sterling arrived at his lawyer's office early. James Mitchell had been his attorney for over 15 years and had helped him structure many of the questionable business deals that had made him wealthy. If anyone understood the legal implications of what Sterling was about to do, it was James. "Richard, I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday," James began as soon as Sterling entered his office. "If you're considering some kind of preemptive disclosure to the authorities, we need to discuss the potential ramifications very carefully." "The ramifications are that I'm going to prison," Sterling said simply. "I'm not looking for a way to avoid that. I'm looking for help doing it properly." James stared at him as if he had suddenly started speaking a foreign language. "Richard, I don't understand. Why would you voluntarily destroy everything you've built? If someone is threatening you, if they're trying to blackmail you, there are ways to handle that." "Nobody is threatening me, James. I'm doing this because it's the right thing to do." For the next 3 hours, Sterling laid out the full scope of his criminal activities. The offshore accounts, the bribery, the tax evasion, the use of shell companies to hide assets. James listened with growing horror as his client systematically confessed to crimes that could result in decades in prison. "My God, Richard," James whispered when Sterling finished. "How did you think you could get away with all of this forever?" "I didn't think about getting away with it," Sterling admitted. "I just kept pushing the boundaries a little further each time and somehow convinced myself that everyone else was doing the same thing." James was quiet for a long time, clearly struggling with the ethical implications of what his client was asking him to do. "Richard, as your attorney, I have to advise you that what you're proposing will destroy your life. Your reputation, your business, your freedom, everything will be gone." "My life is already destroyed, James. I just haven't been honest enough to admit it. At least this way, I have a chance to build something better from the ruins." That afternoon, Sterling and his attorney walked into the offices of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Sterling carried with him boxes of financial records, computer drives, and detailed confessions that documented years of criminal activity. The FBI agents who interviewed him seemed almost suspicious of his complete cooperation. They were accustomed to wealthy criminals who fought every charge and hired armies of lawyers to find technicalities and loopholes. Sterling's willingness to provide evidence against himself was so unusual that they spent considerable time trying to determine if it was some kind of elaborate trap. But as the interview progressed and Sterling answered every question with complete honesty, the agents began to understand that they were dealing with something unprecedented. A wealthy criminal who genuinely wanted to take responsibility for his actions. The news broke that evening. By Tuesday morning, Sterling's voluntary surrender to the FBI was the lead story on every business news program. The reaction was explosive and immediate. Some commentators praised Sterling's courage in taking responsibility for his crimes. Others suggested it was simply a calculated move to reduce his eventual sentence. Business associates distanced themselves from him with statements expressing shock and disappointment at his criminal behavior. Sterling's business empire began to collapse almost immediately. Stock prices for his publicly traded companies plummeted. Partners and clients canceled contracts. Employees who had depended on him for their livelihoods suddenly found themselves facing unemployment. Through it all, Sterling felt an unexpected sense of peace. For the first time in years, he wasn't worried about protecting his secrets or managing his public image. The truth was finally out, and while the consequences were severe, there was a liberation in no longer having to pretend to be someone he wasn't. But the real test came Wednesday evening, when Sterling returned home from another day of interviews with federal investigators. He found Maria in the kitchen, preparing to leave after her day of work. She looked up when he entered, her expression unreadable. "Mr. Sterling." "Maria," he paused, uncertain how to continue. "I wanted you to know that I've done what you suggested. I've turned myself in to the authorities." She nodded. "I know, I saw the news reports. I also wanted you to know that I've taken care of Isabella Santos's medical bills. She's getting the treatment she needs and won't have to worry about the expenses." "That's good," Maria said simply. Sterling studied her face, looking for some sign of approval or satisfaction, but found only calm attention. "Is that enough? Have I done enough to prove that I'm serious about changing?" Maria set down the dish towel she had been holding and looked at him directly. "Mr. Sterling, you're asking the wrong question." "What do you mean?" "You're asking me if you've done enough to satisfy me, as if my approval is what matters. But I was never the person you needed to satisfy." She gestured toward the window, beyond which lay the city where millions of people lived and worked and struggled with problems that Sterling had never bothered to consider. "The people you need to satisfy are all the Isabella Santoses and Santoses whose lives have been damaged by your choices over the years. And more importantly, you need to satisfy the person you want to become." Sterling felt a chill of understanding. "You're saying this is just the beginning." "I'm saying that turning yourself in and paying one family's medical bills is a start. But if you're serious about redemption, then you have years of work ahead of you." Maria picked up her purse and headed toward the door, then paused and looked back at him. "There's one more thing I need to tell you, Mr. Sterling." "What's that?" "I'm resigning from my position here. Today is my last day." Sterling felt a stab of panic. Despite everything that had happened, Maria had become a kind of anchor in his life, the one person who saw him clearly and still offered him hope for change. "Why have I done something wrong?" Maria's smile was gentle but firm. "You haven't done anything wrong. But you don't need a maid anymore, Mr. Sterling. What you need now is to learn how to take care of yourself and figure out who you are without all the wealth and power you're about to lose." As she walked toward the door, Sterling called out to her one last time. "Maria, will I see you again?" She turned back to him one final time, and in her eyes he saw something he had never expected to see: hope. "If you do the work, if you really commit to becoming someone better, then our paths might cross again someday. But not as employer and employee, as equals." 5 years later, Richard Sterling sat in a small apartment on the outskirts of the city, reading a letter that had arrived that morning with no return address. The apartment was modest, with second-hand furniture and walls that needed painting, but it was home. More importantly, it was honest. The past 5 years had been the most difficult of Sterling's life, but also the most meaningful. His legal troubles had played out exactly as he had expected. He had served 3.5 years in federal prison for tax evasion and bribery. His business empire had collapsed completely, leaving him with massive debts and no remaining assets beyond a modest trust fund that his lawyers had managed to protect. His marriage to hadn't survived the scandal, though their divorce had been surprisingly amicable. She had been gracious enough to acknowledge that the man who went to prison was different from the man she had fallen in love with decades earlier. Their children, now adults, had struggled with the shame and anger of having a convicted felon for a father. But slowly, tentatively, they were rebuilding relationships based on honesty rather than wealth. Sterling had been released from prison 8 months ago. Unable to return to the business world due to his criminal record, he had taken a job as a bookkeeper for a small nonprofit organization that provided services to homeless families. The pay was barely enough to cover his basic expenses, But the work gave him something he had never experienced in all his years as a billionaire: genuine satisfaction. The letter he held in his hands was brief, written in elegant handwriting that he recognized immediately. "Mr. Sterling," it read, "I hope this letter finds you well. I wanted you to know that Isabella Santos graduated from high school last week with a full scholarship to study medicine. She wants to become a pediatric oncologist so she can help other children facing what she went through. Her grandmother sends her thanks for everything you did for their family. I thought you should know that your choices made a difference. If you're interested, there's someone I'd like you to meet. Saturday, 2:00 p.m., Riverside Park by the Memorial Fountain. Come alone. M." Sterling read the letter 3 times, his heart pounding with a mixture of excitement and anxiety. 5 years ago, Maria had walked out of his life with the suggestion that they might meet again as equals if he did the work of becoming someone better. He had often wondered if that day would ever come, or if it had simply been a kind way of saying goodbye forever. Saturday arrived gray and overcast, with the threat of rain in the air. Sterling dressed carefully in his only good suit, which was several years old but clean and properly pressed. He arrived at Riverside Park 20 minutes early and found a bench near the Memorial Fountain, watching families enjoy their weekend and trying to calm his nerves. At exactly 2 o'clock, he saw Maria approaching from across the park. She looked essentially unchanged, still beautiful and graceful, though there was something different in the way she carried herself. She was no longer hiding behind the mask of a servant, and her natural confidence was evident in every step. Walking beside her was a young man Sterling didn't recognize. He appeared to be in his late 20s, with dark hair and an intelligent face. He carried himself with the calm assurance of someone comfortable with his place in the world. "Mr. Sterling," Maria said as they reached the fountain. Her voice was warm but still carried that undertone of strength that he remembered so well. "Maria," Sterling stood up, unsure of the proper protocol for this situation. "It's good to see you." "This is my brother Carlos," Maria said, gesturing to the young man beside her. Carlos extended his hand with a smile that seemed genuinely friendly. "Dr. Carlos, it's a pleasure to finally meet you." Sterling shook the offered hand, his mind reeling. "Doctor, you finished medical school." "Neurosurgery residency, actually. I'm starting my fellowship next month." Carlos's smile widened. "I wanted to thank you personally for making my education possible." "I don't understand," Sterling said, looking back and forth between the siblings. Maria gestured toward the bench. "May we sit? There are some things I need to tell you." As they settled on the bench, Maria began to speak in the same calm, measured tone Sterling remembered from their conversations in his mansion. "The money you sent for my brother's education over the years, that was real. Everything I told you about my family's financial situation was true. My grandfather's fortune was largely lost during the political upheavals after his death. Carlos and I have been supporting ourselves through scholarships, part-time jobs, and the wages I earned working for families like yours." Sterling felt confused. "But what about the trust funds you mentioned, the ongoing investments?" "Those were stories I invented to make you believe I had power over you," Maria admitted. "I needed you to think I was dangerous enough to take seriously, but not so dangerous that you would try to have me eliminated." The revelation hit Sterling like a physical blow. "You mean, you never had evidence of my crimes, you couldn't have destroyed me?" Carlos leaned forward, his expression becoming more serious. "Actually, she could have. My sister is extremely good at research and investigation. Over the 3 years she worked for you, she documented enough evidence to put you away for decades, but she never intended to use it as a weapon." "Then why?" Maria turned to face Sterling directly. "Because I wanted to give you the chance to choose redemption for yourself, not because you were forced into it. Real change can't happen under coercion. It has to come from genuine recognition of right and wrong." Sterling sat in stunned silence, processing the implications of what he was hearing. "You're telling me I could have ignored you completely? I could have fired you or even worse, and there would have been no consequences?" "There would have been consequences," Maria said firmly. "Just not the kind you were afraid of. If you had continued down the path you were on, you would have eventually destroyed yourself without any help from me. Men like you always do." "But the name is my grandfather's real name," Maria confirmed. "He was a powerful man, and everything I told you about him was true, but his power died with him. I'm just his granddaughter, working as a maid to pay for my brother's education." Carlos reached into his jacket and pulled out a small notebook, which he handed to Sterling. "Maria kept detailed records of everything she learned about your business practices. She wanted you to have this." Sterling opened the notebook and saw page after page of meticulous documentation. Financial records, meeting notes, evidence of crimes that even the FBI had missed in their investigation. It was enough to add years to any prison sentence. "Why are you giving me this?" Sterling asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Because the evidence doesn't matter anymore," Maria said. "You've already faced justice for your crimes and served your sentence. This is just paper now." Sterling looked up from the notebook, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "I don't understand why you did any of this. Why did you care what happened to me?" Maria was quiet for a long moment, watching a group of children play near the fountain. "Do you remember what you asked me the last time we spoke? You wanted to know if you would see me again." "Yes." "I told you it would depend on whether you did the work of becoming someone better. I've been watching, Mr. Sterling, from a distance, but I've been watching." Carlos nodded. "She followed your trial, your imprisonment, your release. She knew about your job at the homeless shelter, about the volunteer work you've been doing with financial literacy programs. You've been checking up on me. I wanted to know if the change was real," Maria explained. "If you had genuinely learned from your experiences, or if you were just playing another role until you could rebuild your empire." Sterling thought about the man he had been 5 years ago and the man he was today. The differences were so profound that sometimes he felt like they were completely different people. "And what did you decide?" Maria's smile was the first genuinely warm expression he had seen from her. "That you kept your part of our bargain. You did the work." They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, watching the life of the park flow around them. Families, couples, elderly people feeding birds, children laughing and playing. It was the kind of simple human happiness that Sterling had forgotten existed during his years of chasing wealth and power. "There's something else," Carlos said eventually. "Something we wanted to ask you." Sterling looked at him. "I'm starting a nonprofit clinic that will provide free medical services to families who can't afford health care. We're specifically focusing on conditions like the one Isabella Santos faced, situations where lack of insurance can literally mean the difference between life and death." "That sounds like incredible work," Sterling said sincerely. "We want to offer you a position," Maria said. "Nothing glamorous, administrative support, bookkeeping, helping families navigate the financial aspects of their care. The pay would be minimal, basically enough to cover your basic expenses." Sterling felt a surge of emotion that took him completely by surprise. For 5 years, he had been rebuilding his life one day at a time, trying to find ways to make amends for the harm he had caused. The idea of working directly to help families like the Santos family felt like the completion of a journey he had started in his study that day when Maria revealed her true identity. "Why would you want me?" he asked. "Why would you trust someone like me with something so important to you?" Carlos and Maria exchanged a look, and Sterling could see years of shared understanding pass between them. "Because," Maria said, "you understand what it's like to lose everything and have to rebuild from nothing. You understand the difference between having money and having worth. And because you've proven that people can change if they're willing to do the hard work of becoming better." Sterling felt tears finally spill over onto his cheeks. "I would be honored to work with you." As they stood to leave, Maria handed Sterling a business card with the address of the clinic. "Can you start Monday?" "I'll be there." As Carlos walked ahead toward the parking area, Maria lingered for a moment. "Richard, may I call you Richard now?" Sterling nodded, not trusting himself to speak. "I need you to know something. What happened 5 years ago in your study, I wasn't just trying to save you from becoming a monster. I was trying to save myself from becoming one too." "What do you mean?" Maria's expression became distant, as if she were looking back across the years. "I had spent 3 years watching you and people like you treat workers as less than human. I had documented enough evidence to destroy dozens of wealthy families, and I was starting to enjoy the power that knowledge gave me." She looked directly into his eyes. "When I saw you about to assault me over a broken paperweight, I realized I was at a crossroads too. I could use my hidden identity to destroy you out of anger and vengeance, or I could use it to try to save both of us." Sterling understood now why her threat that day had felt different from the extortion attempts he had faced from business rivals over the years. It hadn't been about money or power. It had been about two people standing at the edge of an abyss and choosing which direction to step. "Thank you," he said simply. Maria smiled. "Thank you for proving that people really can change." As Sterling watched them drive away, he thought about the journey that had brought him to this moment. 5 years ago, he had been a billionaire who owned a mansion and commanded an empire but had lost his humanity. Today, he was an ex-convict with a modest apartment and a part-time job, but he had something far more valuable, the knowledge that his life had meaning beyond wealth and power. Monday morning, he would begin a new chapter, working to help families like the Santos family navigate medical crises without losing everything they had worked for. It wasn't the life he had planned, but it was a life he could be proud of. As he walked home through the city streets, Sterling realized that for the first time in decades, he was truly looking forward to tomorrow. Not because of what he might gain, but because of what he might be able to give. And that, he understood now, made all the difference in the world. The man who had once pulled a maid by her hair in a fit of rage had become someone who would spend the rest of his life trying to heal the wounds that kind of anger creates. It wasn't justice in the traditional sense, but it was something perhaps more valuable, true redemption, earned through years of hard work and genuine change. And sometimes that's the most any of us can hope for, the chance to become someone better than who we were yesterday, one choice at a time. And with that, she was gone, leaving Sterling alone in his mansion with the weight of his choices and the possibility of redemption. The question was whether it was too late to change that. The game had changed, and he was no longer the one in control. He was about to discover that some people, no matter how humble they appear, carry secrets that can bring down empires.